I lost 5 years of my life in prison, missed my daughter growing up, and thought I'd never get a second chance. But when I finally found her, I realized the real fight was just beginning, and this time, I wasn't going to lose. Looking back, I realize how life's direction often hinges on seemingly minor moments, those little twists of fate you barely notice until they lead you somewhere you never expected. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew your family, and your last name carried weight. My father managed an aluminum smelting business, while my mother taught at the local school. Together, they instilled in me the values of resilience and hard work. Those lessons stayed with me, even when life started to veer off course. After high school, I left that familiar town behind, driven by a hunger to carve out my own path. College wasn't in the picture for me, so I joined a local construction crew. There was something steadying about the work, the rhythm of it, the way effort transformed raw materials into something real. But beyond the daily grind, what I truly yearned for was a stable life, a family of my own. I dreamed of building more than just houses. I wanted to create a home filled with warmth, love, and shared laughter. Then came Haley, stepping into my life when I was searching for something deeper. She was radiant, fearless, and had this sharp wit that could cut through even the hardest days. We met at a friend's barbecue, and from the moment she flashed that smile, I was hooked. We married quickly, probably too quickly, but back then, I was convinced we could handle anything life threw our way. I believed in us. I was young, full of hope, and, in hindsight, a little too trusting. My name is Charles Klein, and there's one date that's been seared into my memory for years, April 20th, 2010. It's a date that marked the unraveling of everything I once held dear. I came home earlier than planned from a work trip, only to be greeted by a nightmare I'll never forget. My wife of 6 years, Haley, was in our bed, with Trent Miller. Trent was a man I could barely tolerate on my best day, and now he was at the center of my worst moment. Seeing Haley with him was like taking a blow to the chest, but part of me wasn't entirely shocked. Over time, I'd noticed her growing discontent, with me, with our life, and with the circumstances we found ourselves in. The financial crash had hit us hard. We bought our house right before the recession, and now we were drowning in debt, stuck with a mortgage that felt impossible to escape. I thought we were just going through a rough patch, something we'd eventually overcome. What stung the most was that Haley had been the one who pushed for the house, and now she resented the burden it placed on us. Since Christmas, when she'd expressed disappointment with the gifts I gave her, things had gone downhill fast. Haley became increasingly distant, hard to please, and critical of everything. No matter how hard I tried, nothing seemed good enough. The only real joy I had left was in my daughter, Tina. Seeing her light up when I came home each day was a welcome reprieve from the cold, strained atmosphere between Haley and me. Tina was my bright spot, my reason to keep pushing forward, even when everything else was falling apart. I don't know exactly when things started falling apart, but I do know one thing: I never should have married Haley. Looking back now, it feels like a decision made for all the wrong reasons. We were both coming off failed relationships, still nursing wounds that hadn't quite healed. Marrying Haley seemed like the next logical step, as if we were just following a script that everyone else around us was reading from. But, in truth, none of those reasons carried real weight, and none of them laid a solid foundation for what should have been a lifelong commitment. At first, our marriage was rough. We clashed more often than we connected, and for a while, I wondered if we'd made a terrible mistake. But somewhere along the way, I grew to love her, truly love her. When Tina was born, I thought that love had deepened, solidified. I believed we had built something stronger than what we'd started with, something worth fighting for. Now, I'm left wondering if Haley was just a brilliant actress or if she had always been playing a long game, one I was too blind to see. Until last year, I genuinely believed we were happy, or at least stable. Sure, we had the usual ups and downs, but I thought we had a solid relationship, a good family. I was wrong. So wrong. It happened on a Wednesday. I told Haley I'd be home Thursday, but plans changed, and I decided to surprise her by coming back a day early. She had already worked her morning shift and Tina was at school, so the house should have been quiet. Instead, when I pulled up, there was an unfamiliar car parked outside. My stomach knotted, but I tried to brush off the unease, telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a friend stopped by or a neighbor needed something. But as soon as I walked in, I heard it, those unmistakable sounds coming from our bedroom. It wasn't subtle. I didn't need to sneak around to figure out what was happening. I stood there, frozen in place, long enough to take a few pictures on my phone. Oddly enough, I didn't feel anger right away, just this overwhelming sadness, this hollow realization that our marriage was truly over. There would be no fixing this, no coming back from the betrayal. Everything was about to unravel, the financial strain we were already under, the time I'd lose with Tina, the family I thought we'd built. And worst of all, I knew I'd never be able to share that closeness with Haley again. Then Haley saw me. Instead of apologizing or showing any sign of guilt, she screamed, "What the hell are you doing home early, Charlie?" That was the breaking point. Something inside me snapped. I grabbed her by the hair and yelled, "Are you serious? You're in my bed with him, and you're asking why I'm home early?" It was pure instinct, driven by rage and heartbreak. In that moment, I didn't even notice Trent standing behind me until it was too late. Trent, wrapped in a sheet like some ridiculous cliché, must have panicked because he called the police. By the time they arrived, the house was filled with chaos, Haley screaming, Trent trying to look heroic, and me still caught in the whirlwind of my own emotions. The officers rushed in and separated us. I was arrested for grabbing Haley's hair, though I hadn't actually hurt her. It didn't matter. All they saw was a domestic dispute, and I was the one taken away in handcuffs. It took a few days for me to come up with bail. By the time I was released, Haley had already cleared out most of her things. Eventually, the charges against me were dropped, but none of that changed what had happened. The damage was done. Most nights after that, I found myself sitting alone at Johnny's Tavern, nursing a drink and listening to the same old crowd. Drunks who always had a story, guys who'd boast about how they'd never let their wives cheat and laugh like it was some kind of joke. I sat there, half listening, knowing that none of them really understood what it felt like. The betrayal, the humiliation, the way your entire life can shift in a single moment, those were things they could only laugh about because they hadn't lived through it. I kept hearing it over and over again, "You're not a real man if you let another guy steal your wife." Those words echoed in my head, growing louder with each retelling. At first, I tried to brush them off, but after hearing it enough times, they started to gnaw at something deep inside me. Eventually, it became too much. I stopped going to Johnny's Tavern altogether. I couldn't stand the feeling that every pair of eyes was on me, silently judging me, whispering behind my back. At work, things weren't much better. My colleagues didn't know what to say or how to act around me. Some offered hollow pity, while others avoided me altogether, like my failure might somehow rub off on them. Whether it was in my head or real, I felt pathetic. It was like my life had spiraled into something I didn't recognize anymore, and every reminder just made it worse. Then, a few weeks later, everything seemed to fall into place, or maybe fall apart, on one particular night. I had just finished eating at a diner when, by sheer chance, I saw Haley and Trent across the street. They were walking out of a restaurant, laughing like nothing in the world could touch them. As if that wasn't painful enough, I watched them share a kiss before getting into a sleek Lexus. I froze in place, heart pounding with a mix of rage and helplessness. Then, as the cars started to pull away, I saw Haley's head drop into Trent's lap. That was the final blow. I stormed to my old Chevy, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I pounded the wheel a few times, letting the anger out in short, violent bursts. Eventually, I calmed myself down enough to drive off, but the fire inside me didn't die, it simmered, waiting for a spark. That night, I told myself I needed to be smart about this. No more impulsive outbursts. If I was going to do something, I had to plan it out carefully. Over the next few weeks, that thought took root and grew. I tracked Trent down, watching him from a distance, waiting for the right moment. Then, one night, I found him alone. It didn't go as planned. Nothing ever does. What I thought would be a moment of reckoning ended up costing me everything. I won't get into the gritty details, but let's just say things got out of hand fast. By the time it was over, Trent was on the ground, and I was in cuffs. That was October 16th, the day my life took its final nosedive into chaos. When I got to prison, I thought the worst was already behind me. I was wrong. On my first day, I met my new cellmate, Ronald "Iron Ron" Young, a man who made it clear that survival in there came with a steep price. I wasn't interested in anything beyond keeping my head down and doing my time, but prison has a way of stripping you down to nothing, leaving you with impossible choices. Ron and his Aryan gang ran things in our block, and if I wanted to stay alive, I had two options: submit or fight. I chose to fight, at least for a while. But after enough beatings, enough sleepless nights wondering if I'd make it through to morning, the fight started to leave me. 6 months into my sentence, my mom came to visit. Seeing her broke something inside me. She looked older, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. She told me Haley had married Trent and that they had moved to Texas. Worse, they wouldn't let my parents see or talk to Tina. My mom had tried reaching out to Haley's mother, hoping to find some way to keep a connection with my daughter. But Haley's mother, just as cruel as her daughter, reportedly laughed in her face. Cruelty runs in their family, my mom said with a sad shake of her head. Hearing all of this made something inside me snap. I exploded, unable to contain the frustration and grief that had been building for months. I had been married to Haley for 6 years. I never raised a hand to her, never hurt her in any way. Yet, here I was, locked up, fighting for survival, all because I had one moment of weakness, because I lashed out at a man who had betrayed me in the worst possible way. Meanwhile, Haley got everything: the house, our daughter, a new life with Trent. And what did I get? 5 years in prison and no contact with the only person who mattered to me, Tina. Justice? That's a word that stopped meaning anything to me a long time ago. I served my full sentence, every single day of it, without so much as a letter from my daughter. I tried everything I could to regain contact, letters, calls, anything, but nothing ever came of it. Haley had cut me out of Tina's life entirely, and no one seemed willing to help me change that. By the time I got out, it felt like I didn't even know who I was anymore. 5 years behind bars, fighting just to keep my dignity, had changed me in ways I still don't fully understand. All I knew was that I had to find a way to see Tina again, no matter what it took. I noticed the guy staring at me from across the bar. He didn't seem hostile, but in places like this, you learn to keep your guard up. I stayed calm, not wanting to invite any trouble. A few moments later, he approached and offered to buy me a drink. I gave him a polite but firm smile and said, "Thanks, but I'm waiting for someone." That's when Candy, my companion for the evening, placed a hand gently on my shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it told me to stay cool and avoid any unnecessary escalation. I stood up slowly, reached into my pocket, and handed the guy a $20 bill. "I appreciate the offer," I said evenly, "but I'll cover my companion's drink myself." As I extended the cash, I made sure he caught a glimpse of the scars on my knuckles, marks from years spent in prison, where I had learned that words weren't always enough to keep things from spiraling. The tension hung in the air for a moment, thick and heavy, before he finally took the $20 with a slight nod. "Enjoy your evening," he muttered before walking off. Candy smiled as she watched him leave, clearly impressed by how I handled the situation. "Thanks for stepping in like that," she said softly, her eyes reflecting a mix of admiration and curiosity. I exhaled, still a bit on edge from the encounter. Didn't expect things to go that smoothly, I admitted, and I definitely didn't expect you to enjoy this evening as much as you did. Candy chuckled, the sound light and teasing. Well, I am a professional, she said with a playful grin, but there was no trace of judgment in her voice, only kindness. Her response caught me off guard, but in a good way. I sighed, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and disbelief. I've never done this before, I confessed. Honestly, I always thought that someone in your line of work would be more distant. Like they'd just be going through the motions, faking it. But you didn't fake a thing. Her expression softened, and in that moment, her teasing demeanor gave way to something more genuine. Thanks, she said quietly, her voice warm and sincere. That means a lot. Should we order something now? I asked, trying to steer the conversation back to something lighter. We settled in, and before long, we were lost in conversation. For a while, it felt almost normal, like two people just sharing a night out. But beneath the surface, I couldn't help but feel the weight of everything I'd been through, everything I still had to do. After that night, I moved on to the next phase of my plan. The following day, I met with Juan Price at a diner downtown. Juan wasn't just any contact, he was a key figure on the outside for a major black prison gang. We'd crossed paths before, and he knew I wasn't someone to be taken lightly. After a brief negotiation, we struck a deal. The price was set, $155,000. But there was a condition: when the job was done, the man's throat had to be cut in a specific way, sending a clear message to those who'd understand it. One didn't ask many questions, and I didn't volunteer any unnecessary details. In our world, information was a weapon, and I hadn't lasted 5 years in prison by running my mouth. It had only been 4 days since the riot in prison that claimed the lives of 4 inmates. Word spread quickly about the chaos, but the real news was the death of Aryan leader Ronald "Iron Ron" Young. Rumors circulated that Ron had been fatally stabbed during the violence, setting off a chain reaction of brutal retaliations. The suspect in Ron's murder didn't last long, he was eliminated in the chaos that followed. In response, the entire prison was locked down for 3 days, with tensions running high among both inmates and guards. Meanwhile, my little online venture involving the Amy Carson website had reached its conclusion. It was a gamble, but it had served its purpose. I pulled the plug on the online venture before law enforcement could catch wind and turn my life into a bigger mess than it already was. No point in inviting more trouble when I had enough on my plate. Still, when I walked into that bar with a plan in mind, I knew things could get messy in a different way. With my broad frame, a broken nose from years of fights, and a shaved head, I must have looked intimidating. I didn't mind, it gave me an edge. Trent noticed me right away. He tensed slightly, studying me with a mix of caution and weariness. He didn't look as smug as I remembered him. After a brief pause, he asked, "Are we going to have a problem?" I had anticipated this moment long before stepping through the door. I wasn't here to start another fight, I was here for answers. I shook my head slowly and responded in a calm voice, "No. We're not going to have a problem." But the truth was, we'd already had a problem, years ago, when Trent had hit me with that baseball bat. That single moment had cost me 5 years of my life, locked away in a hellhole of a prison, and more importantly, it had stolen from me the chance to watch my daughter grow up. I wasn't about to let anger take over now. I needed to stay focused, keep my head clear. Trent relaxed slightly, though he still eyed me warily. He took a long swig of his beer, then set the glass down and said something I hadn't expected. "Look, I want you to know something," he began, his tone more sincere than I'd ever heard before. "I didn't agree with Haley cutting you and your family out of Tina's life. I thought it was a huge mistake, but she was adamant. She told me to back off, and since Tina wasn't my kid, I didn't have a say." I stayed quiet, absorbing his words. Trent continued, his voice softer now, almost regretful. "I had a good relationship with Tina. I loved her, but I was never her father. And I know she missed you, Charlie. Hearing him admit that hit me harder than I expected. For years, I had told myself that Tina had moved on without me, that maybe she had forgotten me. But hearing that she missed me, it nearly broke me. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to keep it together. Trent went on, his tone turning bitter. Haley and I didn't last. I sued her for infidelity and abandonment, sold the house, and moved here. She cost me a lot, but I guess that's just who she is. There was a grudge in his voice, a lingering bitterness directed at both Haley and, to some extent, at me. But I didn't care about his anger, I only cared about what he had said about Tina. I just wanted to see my daughter, I said quietly, the weight of those words pressing down on me like it always did. Trent gave me a solemn nod. He didn't offer any false promises or empty reassurances. He knew, just like I did, that seeing Tina again wouldn't be easy. I thanked him for the information, bought him another drink, and left the bar feeling more uncertain than ever about my next move. Trent had spent thousands trying to track Haley down and had come up empty-handed. If he couldn't find her with all his resources, what chance did I have? Wasting what little I had left on a fruitless search didn't seem smart. But giving up wasn't an option either. Tina was my daughter, and no matter how impossible it seemed, I had to find her. A few days later, I found myself at Margaret's house. Margaret was an old family friend, someone who had been there for me during tough times. As soon as I stepped through the door, her dog Brutus, a massive Labrador mix, charged at me with all the enthusiasm of an old friend reunited. Brutus had known me since he was a puppy, back when I used to visit Margaret regularly. I'd trained him to sit, stay, and come, and I'd always given him treats whenever I dropped by. "Easy there, boy," I muttered as Brutus eagerly licked my face, his tail wagging furiously. While he reacquainted himself with me, I casually walked over to the counter and grabbed a dog treat from the cookie jar Margaret always kept there. I tossed it onto the floor, and Brutus scrambled after it, giving me a brief moment of peace. As Brutus munched happily on his treat, I took a look around the kitchen. It hadn't changed a bit since the last time I was here, 9 years ago, shortly after John Turner, Margaret's late husband, had passed away. The same cluttered countertops, the same old-fashioned curtains hanging by the window, and even the same familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air. But I wasn't here for nostalgia. I was here because Margaret knew people. If there was anyone who could help me figure out my next move, it was her. I handed over all the information I had meticulously gathered, along with a $500 retainer, to a private investigator in El Paso. After a week of digging, he confirmed that the address and other details were current. Knowing Haley's whereabouts brought a strange mix of emotions, relief, anxiety, and dread. This was the closest I had been to seeing my daughter in years, but I knew the battle ahead wouldn't be easy. That Tuesday afternoon, I found myself standing at my parents' front door. It had been years since I'd seen my father, the last time being the day of my sentencing. I could still remember the look on his face as I was led away in handcuffs. He didn't speak then, but his eyes said it all: sorrow, disappointment, and pain. Now, standing on the other side of that door, I hesitated for a moment, gathering the courage to knock. The door creaked open, and there he was, older than I remembered but still carrying that same presence he always had. I cut straight to the point. "Dad, I need your help. I'm filing for visitation rights." He didn't answer immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly, and when he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with caution. "What exactly are you planning to do? This isn't going to turn violent again, is it?" The question stung more than I wanted to admit, but I couldn't blame him. My past actions had left a mark on all of us, and I knew he had every reason to be wary. I took a deep breath and reassured him. "No, Dad. Nothing like that. I've done my time. I'm no longer on parole, and I have the legal right to petition for visitation. I've already consulted a lawyer. But let's be honest, I'm an ex-convict. It's going to be an uphill battle. I think it would help if you and Mom came with me. If we file together as a family, it might strengthen my case." There was a long pause before he finally nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "But you'd better be sure you're ready for this, Charlie. No turning back." By the next morning, we were on our way to meet with the lawyer. At 36 years old, I found myself once again in the back seat of my dad's car, just like when I was a kid. It felt surreal, like life had come full circle, only this time, the stakes were infinitely higher. As we passed through town, Dad started reminiscing about his childhood road trips. He told us about the time his family drove Route 66 to Los Angeles when he was just 3 years old. Back then, there weren't any big freeways, he said, his voice taking on a nostalgic tone. Just narrow 2-lane roads, and you couldn't drive more than 400 miles a day. It took us 7 days to get to California. My father was hoping for a fresh start after the war. I listened quietly, letting his words wash over me. There was something comforting about hearing those old stories. They reminded me that life was full of new beginnings, even after moments that felt like endings. When we arrived at the lawyer's office, Miss Harper greeted us warmly. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her early 50s, and from the moment we sat down, I could tell she wasn't someone who backed down easily. I laid everything out for her, the timeline of my marriage to Haley, the divorce, and Trent's eventual lawsuit against Haley for infidelity and child abandonment. Miss Harper's interest peaked at that last part. It didn't exactly paint me in the best light, but it certainly didn't make Haley look innocent either. As we talked, my mother, who had been trying to stay composed, suddenly broke down. She couldn't hold back her emotions anymore, and tears streamed down her face as she spoke about how much she missed Tina. Seeing my mother so broken seemed to shift something in Miss Harper. Whatever reluctance she may have had about taking on the case vanished in that moment. "I'll take care of it," Miss Harper said firmly. "We'll file the petition for visitation immediately. I'll also request that a court-appointed social worker be present during the initial meeting with Tina." She then emphasized one crucial point: given Haley's history of preventing both you and Trent from seeing Tina, I'll ask the court to ensure that she isn't notified of the meeting beforehand. If she knows, she'll likely try to delay it or manipulate the situation further. Hearing that gave me a glimmer of hope. For the first time in a long while, it felt like I had a real chance. Miss Harper was already preparing the necessary paperwork, and all we had to do now was wait. I could hardly believe it when the judge granted our request and scheduled the meeting for the very next day. After years of waiting and hoping, we were finally going to see Tina again. We were instructed to pick her up directly from school, with the court order in hand. I was overwhelmed with gratitude, hugging Mom and Dad tightly and thanking them for standing by me through it all. Without their support, I wouldn't have made it this far. The next 22 hours dragged on endlessly. Every minute felt stretched, filled with anxious anticipation. We stayed close to the hotel, barely venturing beyond the diner across the street where we grabbed a quick meal. Despite the good news, a gnawing fear lingered in the back of my mind: what if something went wrong? What if Tina wasn't at school when we arrived? What if Haley somehow found out and tried to interfere? My parents tried to reassure me, but I could see the same worry reflected in their eyes. The next afternoon, we arrived at Miss Harper's office at exactly 1 p.m. By 1:35, we were joined by a short, stout woman who introduced herself as Marie Hernandez, the court-appointed social worker who would oversee the visit. She had a calm, reassuring presence, which helped ease some of the tension I felt. We made our way to Tina's school together, clutching the court order like it was a lifeline. When we finally saw Tina, my heart nearly stopped. She was standing in the hallway, holding her backpack and looking around uncertainly. I could tell she didn't recognize me at first. It had been years since we'd last seen each other, and I wasn't the same man I had been back then. But when she caught sight of my father, her daddy, as she had called him when she was little, her face lit up with recognition. "Daddy," she cried, mispronouncing Grandpa just like she always had as a child. Dad scooped her up into his arms, kissing her on the nose as she giggled softly. It was a moment I would never forget, watching the bond between them rekindle as if no time had passed at all. Tina's gaze eventually shifted toward me, and I saw the hesitation in her eyes. She wasn't sure what to make of me, a man who had once been her father but now seemed like a stranger. Just as Mrs. Hernandez had advised, I let her reconnect with my parents first. They still looked the same, still shared that unique, comforting bond with her. After a few minutes, I knelt down, opening my arms wide, silently praying that she would accept my hug. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped toward me, wrapping her small arms around my neck. I held her tightly, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. It was as if all the pain and waiting had led to this one fragile moment, and I didn't want to let go. As we prepared to leave the school, everything took a tense turn. Haley showed up unexpectedly, her face twisted in anger. She stormed toward us, her voice raised as she demanded to know what we were doing with Tina. The situation escalated quickly, and Mrs. Hernandez had to step in firmly. "Ma'am, we are here under a court order," she said, holding her ground. "If you continue to cause a scene, I will have to call the police. You will be arrested and held until you calm down." Haley glared at us, her eyes filled with fury, but she didn't say another word. The assistant principal, sensing the tension, stepped in and ushered Haley into her office, giving us a chance to slip away with Tina and Mrs. Hernandez. We hurried out of the school and walked a few blocks to a small cafe where we could talk in peace. At the cafe, I took a deep breath and gently held Tina's hand. "One day, you'll have to ask your mom about everything," I said softly. "But not today. Today, it's just us, you, me, and your grandparents. We all love you, and we just want to hear about what's been going on in your life. How's school? Do you play any sports? Who are your friends?" For 3 hours, we talked and laughed, trying to bridge the gap that the years apart had created. Time flew by in a blur, and before I knew it, it was time to take Tina back to Haley's house. We wanted to respect the court's time limit, knowing that any misstep could jeopardize future visits. When we pulled up to the curb, Haley was waiting on the porch, cigarette in hand, her expression a mix of anger and frustration. As I parked, another car pulled up behind us. My heart sank. For a brief moment, panic set in. Was this about the fight with Ronald Young years ago? Had someone finally tracked me down for the fake internet scam I had pulled? Just as the fear began to overwhelm me, 4 police officers stepped out of their cars. I froze, expecting the worst. But instead of approaching me, they headed straight for Haley and the man standing beside her, Barry Stewart. Mrs. Hernandez was the first to meet the officers at the front door, while Dad and I watched, confused and anxious. Within moments, Haley and Barry were handcuffed. My mind was spinning. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We don't know yet," Mrs. Hernandez replied, her expression grave. "I don't think Tina's been hurt," Mrs. Hernandez said carefully, her voice steady but serious. "But some things in her room were concerning. The police need to investigate further, and for now, Tina will be safe with me. Please trust me, this is for her well-being. Call Miss Harper. We'll keep you updated." It took 3 long weeks before we finally learned the full story. Those weeks felt endless, filled with anxiety and unanswered questions. Thankfully, with Miss Harper's expertise and persistence, everything ended in our favor. The toy Mrs. Hernandez found in Tina's room turned out to be a hidden camera, a horrifying discovery that validated all of our concerns. Haley's actions, paired with Barry's history, painted a clear enough picture for the court to rule in my favor, granting me primary custody of Tina. For a while, things seemed to settle. Haley eventually moved back to town, and in an attempt to foster a healthy relationship between Tina and her mother, we allowed a few supervised visits at her grandmother Margaret's house. At first, everything seemed fine, but soon, things began to take a turn. One day, I received a call from Margaret. Her voice was shaky, and I could tell she was struggling to get the words out. "I don't want to do this, Charlie," she said, clearly distressed. "But I have to tell you something. Haley has been saying terrible things about you and Hank. I can't believe the person she's become. It breaks my heart, but I don't want to lose my granddaughter. I think it's best if Haley isn't around Tina anymore." Hearing that from Margaret, Haley's own mother, was difficult, but not surprising. Haley's behavior had become increasingly erratic, and I knew Margaret only wanted to protect Tina. 2 weeks later, Haley returned to Texas. What I didn't expect was to hear, a year later, that she had moved back in with Barry Stewart after he was released on parole. The last update I received from Margaret was that Haley and Barry had moved to Nicaragua after Barry violated his parole. In the years that followed, I did everything I could to create a stable life for Tina. I worked closely with her therapist, who was careful not to make any definitive claims but suggested that Haley's behavior pointed to deeper psychological issues. The goal was always to help Tina process her emotions in a healthy way, without turning her against her mother. Over time, she adjusted well. She excelled in school and found joy in art and sports. Watching her grow into a bright, compassionate young woman became my greatest source of pride. Last Saturday, Tina and I participated in a fun run at Crystal Lake, a 25-mile bike ride followed by a 10K run. We stuck together for most of the ride, but during the last 2 miles, we trailed behind a woman who was pedaling with remarkable speed despite having a prosthetic leg. Tina was captivated by her courage and determination, impressed by how someone could compete so fiercely despite such an obstacle. The woman reminded me of Candy. Though her prosthetic leg was different, and her hair was now short and brown, something about her presence brought back memories. I kept my eyes on the road, focusing on the race, but I couldn't help glancing at her from time to time. When the race ended, Tina suggested we stop at a cafe by the river for lunch. Casey agreed, I said, turning to Tina. "Sure, I love that place." We headed toward the cafe, and Casey, now a close friend, smiled as she remembered it too. "I think I should let you two have some father-daughter time," she said, her expression softening. I grinned and shook my head. "Casey, that's sweet of you, but we've been spending time together all week. I think Tina would enjoy some company with someone closer to her age. Please, don't disappoint us, join us." "Are you sure?" she asked, hesitating slightly. "I'm sure," I said with a wink. As we ate lunch, I couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of peace. For so long, life had been a whirlwind of chaos and uncertainty. Now, sitting there with Tina and Casey, things felt steady. Normal. "You're going to have your hands full," Casey said quietly, smiling as she watched Tina chat animatedly. "She's already a beautiful young woman." "I trust her," I replied. "She's got a good head on her shoulders." Casey smiled again. "I appreciate you letting me join you today. I didn't know what to expect and you recognized me at the race." "I'm glad I did," I said, sighing softly. "I need to be honest though, I haven't seen Tina connect with someone this quickly in a long time. It means a lot." Casey shared updates about her own life. She had gotten a steady job, was earning a good income, and had health benefits. She had even managed to get a new prosthetic leg. "I quit the day I was hired," she said, referring to her past work. "My medical bills are paid, and things are finally stable." I nodded, relieved for her. "And how's your family? I remember you mentioned being estranged from them for a while." "You have a good memory," she said with a faint smile. "Mom and I are talking again. Dad, he still struggles with what I did, but he's trying. He'd rather mortgage the house than see me fall back into that life. Some people might have thought I was foolish for letting someone with Candy's past get close to Tina. But I didn't see it that way. Everyone deserved a second chance, and Candy had worked hard to turn her life around. 2 years before that race at Crystal Lake, I had been dating a woman, and things were getting serious. One day, she asked me about my missing front teeth. I decided to tell her everything, the full truth about my past, including the fight with Ron Young. She didn't take it well. A few months later, she became distant, and eventually, she disappeared from my life entirely. It was clear she couldn't handle the weight of my history. Now, though, I felt something different, a sense of peace. Life wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was better. The shadows of my past were still there, but they felt distant, more like faded memories than heavy burdens. Tina's accomplishments, her track meets, her art exhibits, became the anchor that kept me grounded. And Casey. Casey reminded me that love, when built on trust and shared understanding, could heal even the deepest wounds. Later that evening, as the three of us sat by the river, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope.